Okay, so the first step is going to be to first set up our model units. So I'm going to go down to this millimeters tab at the bottom, click Unit Settings, open up my document properties. I'm going to bring this to, you can model in either inches or feet. I'll model in feet for this thing, for this roof canopy. And I'm going to change this down here to feet and inches. It'll be a little bit more clear when we type in inch dimensions. So we hit OK. And last thing I want to do is just kind of make sure that my grid is large enough for the object that I'm modeling. And the line count here is going to be a little small relative to the size of the object. So I'm going to change this to something like 500 feet. Major lines every 10 feet or something like that. And expand my grid a little bit so that I'm always modeling near the origin and I know where I am in space. Okay, so the next thing then I'm going to pop into my top view, zoom out a little bit, and I'm going to open up my plan view and I'm going to bring that in as a reference. For the modeling, we really only need, in this case, in the way that I'm going to do this, we really only need the elevation and the plan. I'm going to bring the plan in first, scale it, and start taking lines from it to start setting the overall shape, at least from the top view. Okay, so what I'm going to do is in Rhino, I'm going to type in picture. This is in Rhino 6. The command is picture. In Rhino 5, it's picture frame. So I'm going to hit picture. 1 second, actually. Put those files in a better place. Okay, yeah. So I'm going to type in picture and find my files. You probably have yours on the desktop, which will be easier to find than mine. So here's my plan view. And this is an aerial view. It's a pretty low quality aerial view, unfortunately, but it's okay for what we need. And I'm going to scale it up a little bit randomly. If you hold shift, it'll kind of allow you to skew it, so be careful with that. Just kind of bring it up to about that size. And the other thing I'm going to do now is head into my layers. This default layer, I'm going to change its name to, let's say, pick ref for picture references. And then I'm going to make a new layer right away called construction before I get too far, and I'm going to make that layer red. Okay. And now I'm going to draw a construction line across, and I'm going to scale this roof canopy here from that point to that point, ignoring some of the fuzz in the image, to 160 feet long, which is, I think, pretty close to the size of the structure. But the other thing I want to do also is rotate this. So what I'm going to do first is just draw a point somewhere around there. And then I'm going to type in rotate. Okay. The image is what I want to rotate. So I'm going to select this. I'm going to bring this to about a point where I think it's about at its center. And then I'm just going to hold shift and lock that into kind of an orthographic position. And again, this doesn't have to be 100% perfect because I'm going to end up fixing it a little bit when I draw that curve. And again, this is a pretty low quality image anyway, so we're really just using it as a way to get started and kind of get a sense for the shape in the top view. All right, so I'm going to run to the construction layer, and I'm going to start scaling this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a point once again here, because it's good to have a reference. I'm going to then draw a construction line across, holding the shift key, or you can use ortho down at the bottom. It's up to you. And then I'm going to grab a point, and with my near ortho option selected down at the bottom, the snap selection down at the bottom called near, I'm going to kind of snap to that line and drag across and click along that line at a point that's about at the end of the roof canopy, like that. All right. And then we're gonna use that point-to-point distance as a reference that we're going to rescale the image to 160 feet. So you can select everything on the screen, type in scale. Your base point is your first point, second point is the second point, and then we can type in 160. Okay, so now of course that's gotten much larger. I'm going to move everything just for a minute. And So we have our image now that's scaled more or less to where we'd like it to be. Okay, the next step is to then start fleshing out this curve here the best to our ability. And I'm going to draw another construction line down in this direction. I'm going to find a point that seems to be around the area from where that curve might stop or begin. I'll draw another construction line out this way, and I'll just kind of connect the dots down here. That way I've got a reference. The one thing I also want to do is make sure that this line, so I'm going to trim this line so that it is a single line between point to point. And the reason is I want to find the midpoint. I want to know exactly where that midpoint is. And I'll snap a point to that to show you. I'm going to use that as a way to organize where my control point goes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this point, holding shift down a bit somewhere like that. And we can adjust this later, but I want to reference, I want to make sure that when I draw the control point curve that I'm putting control point exactly in the center of this curve here. So I'm going to go over to my control point curve over here. I'm going to click those 3 points like this, and I'm going to end the command. Okay. You could get rid of this point if you like. I'm going to do that for the sake of clarity, because what I'm going to do now is turn on the control points here of that point and edit it so that it's closer to the curvature and that's seen in the image. Yeah, and, again, it's going to be a little blurry, but as a reference, it's good enough. Okay. Okay, now in order to set the width, the overall width to make this a symmetrical roof canopy at about 80 feet wide, I'm going to find the midpoint of that curve, which I can snap to, or to be 100% accurate, just to make sure, just in case there's any goofiness in the line, I can draw a construction line out this way, find a point at my intersection, which should be right at your midpoint, no problem. And then from that point down here, I'm going to draw a line up 80 feet in that direction, holding shift, after I typed in 80 up in the command line. So all I did is I clicked polyline, or line segment, I typed in 80, and I'm holding shift now to set that length. We can now use this line to mirror from the midpoint that curve around. Okay. And we actually don't need this line anymore, so I'm going to delete that so that we don't get confused. We have our construction lines as necessary, and we've more or less shaped the roof, at least in the top view. Okay. I'm now going to hide that image and turn that pick layer back on again, because I'm going to drop in another picture reference. But before I do that, I want to center my model to the origin using this as a midpoint. I'll type in the move command, click the center point of that line that went across vertically, and type in 0, 0, 0, and hit enter. And this is just good habits, kind of setting your model up to be centered in the Rhino world, in the Rhino file. Okay, so the next step then is to reference the elevation view. So I'm going to type in picture, or picture frame if you're in Rhino 5, grab the elevation, and I'm going to drop it in somewhere over here for a moment. I'm going to make it too small on purpose, because what I'm going to do is rescale it relative to the length of that line from point to point. Okay. So let's make sure our image is straight. Go back to my construction layer, drop in a point where we think we might be able to line up to our top view. I'm going to draw a construction line straight across like we did before, and I'm going to see that I need to adjust my image a little bit to get this curve a little more accurate. So again, once again, we're going to rotate this image and type that in, rotate. The center of my rotation is my first point, and then I'm going to click across for the second point reference up here to that point, and then I'm just going to kind of lock that in up at the to our construction line there. So what we've done is we've rotated the image to be a little more straight on from point to point at least. And then I'm going to draw another construction point at this other end, and I'm going to use that as a way to reference the scaling of this image. Again, matching the length of that point-to-point distance to the length of this line. So the first thing we can do is go ahead and we can select the image, just to keep this a little easier, and we can move it from that point at the beginning there over in plan to this point here. Oops. And then we can go ahead and scale this. So type in scale. Initial point is our reference. You can hold shift and lock a point in along here like so. Click there. And then I'm going to go ahead and scale this up and click at the end there. Okay. So those two views are now aligned pretty well. And interestingly, what we can kind of see here is that the curve and plan, or at least the way we've drawn it, is very similar to the curve and elevation. It's a kind of a nice relationship between the plan and elevation of the building. And in fact, if we would like, we can kind of fudge it a little bit so that they're dead on. As a matter of fact, I think I'll do that. So I'm going to take this curve once again. By selecting it, I can activate its control point in Rhino 6. In Rhino 5, you'll have to click this button over here, the control points button. And I'm just going to drag it down a little bit, just so that it kind of matches up a little bit better to our elevation. Now, if we do that, of course, we're going to have to redo this mirroring over here, okay? And that's okay. That's pretty straightforward. Let's turn this layer off for a second. I can delete this and this. I'm going to draw a line from that midpoint out again, 80 feet. And from its middle, we can mirror the arc. Let's see, midpoint here. Holding shift, and there we go. So now we're back on track. And you know, I showed you this not to confuse you, but just as a little bit of practice on how you kind of go back and forth, trial and error to find the right form. Sometimes you have to make another decision that forces you to go back on something you've already started. Now the good thing is we have a curve that we can just kind of rotate down in the other view. We don't necessarily have to redraw this curve in the side view because it matches our image. But let me walk you through the process in the event that that was not the case. I'm going to take this image, which we know we dropped in the top view, and I'm going to use my gumball here, which you can turn on and off down at the bottom here with the gumball button. Grab my red axis on my screen and hold shift and lock that into its vertical position. And what we've done is actually we've made a little bit of a mistake. By using the gumball, we've rotated it from the center of the image, but not necessarily from our center line here. So hit Control Z. And what we want to do instead is rotate this in 3D using this line as an axis. So type in rotate 3D. This is our object that we want to rotate. The start of our axis is, of course, here. You can end it anywhere along that line using the near snap. The angle for first, you can just hold shift and click anywhere in that direction in the negative Y, and then flip it down, holding shift, click again when it's vertical, and now you've rotated it perfectly. Okay, so now that you've flipped the image to be oriented properly in the elevation view, you can see that now in our front view. And since we made the top curve match that of the elevation, all we need to do in this case is just flip this down and using the same method. So we can click rotate 3D, axis using the same construction line, hold shift in the negative Y, and flip it down, holding shift again until it's in the negative z direction. And one thing I forgot, actually hit Control Z if you followed along there. One thing I forgot is to click the copy option in my command line before I did that. So go ahead and repeat that command, rotate 3D, select your curve, and there should be an option after I set my axis here to copy it. And you can see up in the command line, after you set your axis, you could click the copy button up top to say yes, and that will keep a copy of my original and make a new one for us, like that. Okay. All right. So if I go into my front view, you can see now that I've got a curve down here that matches the elevation curve, at least at the lower profile, this kind of outer and lower profile. We still need this view though to draw this curve up at the top, because we're going to need that to set the height of our rib sections that go across, our beams that go across the roof canopy there. All right. So while we're still in our construction layer, we can start constructing that. And we're going to use this, even though it doesn't appear exactly to be the exact midpoint, or maybe it is, we really don't know. I mean, it's likely that this is actually our midpoint, but our images at this point are going to start misaligning because they're not 100% accurate. But we're going to use the midpoint that we used earlier as a way to set also the midpoint for this top curve, so that our construction setup is proportional. So I'm going to draw a construction line off of this this original point here, okay, in my front view. And I'm going to just hold shift and go upward with it like this. Doesn't matter how long. I'm going to draw another construction point here somewhere above, because I know I'm going to need that to edit, and then fire up the control point curve command one more time. And we're drawing along this plane still, and we're going to move it back in space later. So, because I already have a control point here, so, or an end point here, so I'm going to go ahead and click that again. Click this is my second point, and that'll end it off over here as my third. Now we're pretty close. Our curve is slightly different, and what we're going to do is fix this a little bit in a second. But for now, I think we're in pretty good shape. And referencing this, I might just drag that up a little bit to keep the offset more consistent like that. All right, so now I'm going to get a little picky, and I'm going to fine-tune this a little bit. If we put this back in space, we would see that we're making a straight line from there back. I actually would prefer that there's a curve, a little bit of a curve, so that these sections, they go from pretty steep to more shallow, 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 all the way at the end until it's the most shallow curve down here, but it's never a straight line. And so what I'm going to do is draw another construction line up in this direction, and then I'm going to copy this point here, just up a bit, maybe about, I don't know, 16 inches or a foot, something like that. So maybe something like this, just to give me a little bit of a curve later on. And then I'm going to take this, as a matter of fact, I won't do that, but what I am going to do is mirror this point around. So I'm going to select that point I just drew, mirror it from this center line here to the other side. Let's try that again. There we go. Okay, and there it shows up over here. I'm going to use that point now to set a tangent from this point tangentially to that curve, because I don't really like the way it's ending. We have a nice sweeping curve up here, but then it gets a little bit maybe too high along this end. It looks like it goes a little straighter, and then it starts to curve. So to get a little bit more accurate with it, instead of using control points for that, I'm going to use a tangent line, and I'm going to trim it so that it starts curved and then ends up straight coming to that point. All right, so to do that, making sure that my tangent O snap is selected, I'm going to draw a line from that point, and I'm going to use the near snap to find my tangent. You can see it there. Click there, and you can do the same thing on the other side. use the near snap, drag along until Rhino finds a tangent for you, and there it is. These lines I just drew I can use to trim the curve. So I'm going to grab that. The other thing you're probably going to want to do is lock your picture reference layer because it keeps selecting it on me. So let's trim like this. And because this line is tangential to that curve, it's a smooth continuation. There won't be any weird lumpiness in here. It's a perfect tangent from the shape of that curve relative to that point. And you can see now that I've got maybe a little bit of a better overall profile. There's an offset here, and we're going to live with that for the sake of this tutorial. Again, as a reference, I think it's fine. But what we wanted is a little bit more of a continuous offset between the top of this image, I guess, in the image where the top of the structure is, and the curve that we just drew as our top curve. Okay, so we can turn off this layer for picture references. I think we're pretty much good on that. And we can go back to our perspective view in order to set this curve in its proper position. And the first thing I'm going to do is join those three segments like this. And then I'm going to move it, typing in move. From that point, I'm going to put it right in the center. We should probably check to see if this is still at the center. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to move it first, and then I'm going to see if that's actually still centered. Just to make 100% sure. So this is for sure center. This is my midpoint. Draw that across to make sure it intersects. Yeah, see, it looks like we're a little bit off because we made that adjustment earlier. So actually, let's Control Z this a few times. Go back to where we were. Delete that. There's an issue there. Find the midpoint of that line that connects the two outer arcs. Construction line back. Construction line this way. Draw a point at the intersection to keep it clear. And now we could grab this join line, bring its point with it, why not? And just move that across. Okay, oops. Like this. If any of that got confusing, raise your hand. We'll come over and clear that up for you. Okay, the last thing then is to rotate this bottom curve here so that it's in the right position. What I mean by that is, let's take a look at some of these images here. We should be able to see it in this detail. You can see that the curve that sets the bottom profile here, this outer profile, it's not orthogonal to the elevation. It actually kind of sweeps out a little bit. You can get a better view of that here, maybe. You can see that this is a suspension cable that is tied between these two foundation walls, and all of the arched beams are connected to that suspension cable. And they have different distances apart from one another. So in plan, we know that it bulges out a little bit. So if we know that, then we know that this curve here has to bulge out along with it. So actually, the curve that we drew in elevation, like this, needs to actually also match in the top view. And that's a pretty straightforward thing to do using control points. So all we got to do is turn this on, go to our top view, and in the perspective view, I'll grab the control point. You know what, I'm going to turn that on to make it easier. And once I have that selected, I'll go back to my top view, use my gumball to drag that curve out. Okay, and I'm going to zoom in a little further, and I want it to match the curve that I have drawn in plan like that. And I'm going to eyeball that because there's no other way to do it. Well, there is, but this is good enough. And I'm going to just make that pretty much align directly with our top view. And now if we go back into perspective, we can see that this line is now drawn in this angle, right? So we got our cable being kind of swept across in elevation and plan simultaneously. That means we no longer need that curve. but you're welcome to keep a record of all of your construction lines, which I recommend. And at this point, it may not be a bad idea. We can get rid of some of this older stuff as well. But at this point, it's not a bad idea to keep a copy of your progress. So I'm going to copy everything that we've just drawn. I'm going to move it over here, back in space. So that as I keep continuing, even if I end up deleting that line like that, I could find it later in case I need it again for some reason. I'll also delete a couple of these other construction lines that might get in the way as we keep working. And our form is pretty much set. All we need to do now is mirror this across. Let's use this as our mirror line. Let's make sure it looks good. Looks like it's matching up with the other point here. That's good. Okay. And what I'm going to do is set up a new layer, because now it's starting to get a little confusing between what's an actual profile and what is a construction line. So I'm going to make a new layer and call it profiles. Turn that layer white. Select our 3 profiles that we have drawn so far. Change their layer to the profiles layer. So now we're making a distinction between the construction lines and the finished profile that we've just drawn. Okay, let me just show you my finished model here just for a minute to show you where we're going. The next step is going to be to divide those curves. And we're going to use those divisions to draw our sections across, find our perpendicular directions, use that as a way to orient a cross-section shape, and start drawing our structure, eventually amounting to a model that will be like this. So you can see the kind of form and structure relationship playing out. The first thing we drew is the form overall using 3 lines, which is all we needed to describe this shape in 3D. And we're going to start building our sections from ground up in between. There won't be any trimming away at surfaces here. All of this is constructive. None of it is deconstructive, if you will, meaning that we're not modeling things that are larger than they need to be in order to split them or cut them later. No Booleans. This is a fully constructive model. Okay. So back to my construction layer, I'm going to select this top curve. And I'm going to type in divide. By default, the number of segments for me is 22. You can go ahead with that. That's the cheat sheet model that I just showed you does that into 22 segments, which means you're going to end up with 23 points overall because of the last endpoint. You can go ahead and click OK there. To run that command, you're going to have to type in 22 yourself in order to get it to divide like I just did there. And we're dividing this one because we're going to use that to find the points along these. And the way to do that is something I showed earlier in class, which is to use the section command and find the points along here by sectioning this line using those points as a reference. So in my top view, I'm going to run the section command. The objects that I want to section is just this bottom curve here. You don't need to do both of them because we can mirror it. And just to make sure I'm snapping into the right point, I'm going to go to my perspective view for a moment. I'm going to head back to my top view, and you can start sectioning across. Yep. And this one's just going to give us the endpoint. This one will give us the next one down. And this is the way that I'm going to ensure that these points have a direct orthogonal relationship to one another from the middle arch to the end profile. Because if I run the divide command on the outer profile, the white one down below on the screen, it's likely that those points won't line up because they're not the same length. And here I want to make sure well, it doesn't really matter, I guess. So that's our center. And you can see that I'm just going to go through this process manually here, clicking to each point along the division, or the results of the division, and going for it like that. Okay. Now, when you click enter or space bar, that'll end the command, but you don't have to click away from the points that were just created. They're still selected for you, which is good, which means you can then just type in the mirror command and mirror these across using this line here, because we know that that's dead center. You can hold shift to make sure it snaps to the right position. As a matter of fact, I think what I'm going to do is delete this one to make it clear that I'm always using that one as my mirror. Okay. And now we've got our division lines, our division points along all of our profiles. Okay, so let's draw our sections across, at least the center lines of all of our structural sections going across these points here. So I'm going to set up a new layer, just call it sections. I'll make this one blue, and I'm going to activate that layer. And then I'm going to draw, instead of control point curves, I'm going to hold this down. So I'm going to hold my mouse button down, open up this menu, and click the second one in, which is the interpolate points command. And now I'm going to click from here to there to there. And you can kind of see what I'm just going to connect the dots using that command along each set of 3, like this. So go ahead and do that. And I'll just keep going as you work here. Yeah. So we have a nice set of sections that are continuous in the form that they make. The form that they create as a series of parallel sections will be smooth because of the overall profiles that we use to make them. Had we started with these blue sections, there'd be no way to guarantee that your form in the end won't have lumps in it or unnatural curvature. Just some of the issues that we saw with the boat project. Okay, keep going. And actually, I could have drawn just half of these and then mirrored the rest, but just for the sake of demonstration, I drew them all. Okay, and this would probably be a decent moment to make a copy of your progress, which I'll do right now, just to get you into the habit of it. I'm going to drop this down like that. Oops, that's fine, and then I'm just going to select that copy and just shove it back over this way. And what I like to do is keep my copies organized. I usually draw a construction line out across from one of these random points like this. And I'll move this copy right over so that it matches that line. And then everything is in line perfectly when I want to go check back and look at it later. Okay. And here we are. So we have our sections drawn across. The next thing we need to do, and I can show you again in my other finished model, is here. What we need to now do is orient a set of construction lines that are perpendicular to these curves at their endpoint. And we're going to need that because what we want to do is make sure that when we draw our model in 3D, our rib sections, beams going across, that they're facing, their outer edge is facing the ground, or are at least perpendicular to the direction of the curve. And I can show you that maybe a little bit more clearly in a photograph. Let's see. Yeah, maybe this one works. That's a little blurry. Let's go back to this one. Yeah, you can see that here. So they're not mitered or anything like that. They're cut basically 90 degrees to this section shape, you know, and because of that, they connect to this cable naturally and quite well. And they distribute the loads from the center line down directly to the center line of the cable, which is what you want it to do. So there's no shear there. All right. So back into our construction layer, turn that on. And this is something that I showed you guys in class, and you also tried this with the boat tutorial. If we type in the line command, you know that there's a perpendicular option for that up in the command line, so click that. The other thing I'm going to do is turn off of my profile layer because I don't want to get the command confused between which curve it's selecting. And once we have perpendicular activated, we can click a point along that curve that we want to set our perpendicular line to, and of course in this case is the endpoint. And now make sure you're remembering that to hold off for a second, click first point up in the top, or just type in F, that will also work. So if you type in F or click this button, it's going to force the line to begin at the point you just selected, which was the end. The end of a line now is going to ask you to select somewhere in space. Now here's where if you hold shift and you're not snapping to anything else, it will draw it perpendicular up in the Z direction. The other thing I'd like to do is make sure all my construction lines in this case are the same length. And what you can do here, even though it's asking for the end of line, you can type in a number. And I'm just going to type in 3 as a random value. It doesn't really matter. And now that is going to set, now as I hold shift, it's forcing that line to be no longer than 3 units, in this case 3 feet. And I'll click OK. And now I've drawn that line 3 feet across, up in the Z direction that's perpendicular to this section here. So this part gets a little bit repetitive. I'm going to do one more as a demonstration, then I'll pause and let you guys work. So once again, it's line, perpendicular, start at the end, type in F, hit enter, type 2 or 3, whatever, hit enter, hold shift, click when it's in the Z direction. And you've drawn your perpendicular curve. Let's fire that up one more time. Perpendicular, click, F, enter, 3, enter, holding shift, click. Okay. So go ahead and continue along. You can do half of these and mirror the rest if you want to save a little bit of time. To do that, let's identify exactly which one is our center line, and we know that this one is because it's directly at the center of my file here, and it's the longest. If we go into our side view, you can see that. And what I'll do in this case then, so that we never forget that that's our center line, I'm going to go and I'm not going to change its layer, but I'm going to change its color. So I'm going to go to the properties of the object, change its display color to, let's say, yellow, and now I know that that's always my center. So as I keep working, I know where I can stop. And I can stop here and mirror the rest across so I don't have to keep doing that manual process. All right, so why don't you guys go ahead and do that, and I'm going to pause the video so I can finish mine as well. Okay, I'm going to turn this back on. You can see that I've modeled all of these. And I'm going to select, not the center one because I don't need to mirror that. I'm going to select just the rest of them that go back here to the beginning. And type in mirror. And now I can mirror everything off of that line there, that point of our center line. You can see, and I'm going to hold shift down in the -y as my axis, and there we are. So I can save myself some time because this is a symmetrical form. Okay. Delete that. All right. Okay. Okay, so to wrap up part 1 here, the next thing we're going to do is orient a section profile, meaning the outer edge of the thickness of these beams, to each one of the construction lines we just drew relative to our section line here. Okay. There's a couple ways to do that. I'll show you both. First thing, I'm going to make a new layer. Call this beam curve. Maybe there's a better title for that, but for now that's fine. I'll change my color to cyan, something I can see, and go ahead and fire up that command, that layer. And then I'm going to go to the rectangle command. Click somewhere over here in the top view. do that for now. And I'm going to set the size of this thing. So the first thing I'm going to do is set an 8-inch dimension for one side. And for this, I'm going to type in 8, and then make sure you type in inch. So the quotation will make it 8 inches instead of 8 feet. Remember, you're in feet units, so you have to type in 8 inches manually. Hit enter, and then for our overall, in this case, it will be the width, which actually is the length, but the other dimension here will be 16 inches. Okay, you can go ahead and click enter. So now we have, and I can double check on that, we have a rectangle that we've drawn at 8 by 16. Okay. So the first option to orient this rectangle to these curves is to use the orient 3-point command. This is going to need one more step in order to make this work, and that's going to be an offset. So back into my construction layer for a minute. I'm just going to offset these curves at a distance that's 1/2 the width of this, so 4 inches. All right. Now I'll show you why in a minute. So click distance up top, type in 4 inches. Your curve to offset is here, and just go ahead and click that off in the orthogonal negative x direction or positive x. I'm going to go negative x to keep it all consistent. Okay, like that. And I'm just going to do 3 of them just to show you an example. Okay. The next thing we can turn our beam curve layer on again and type in orient. And by default, our options will show up. And orient 3-point is one of them. This object that we want to orient is here. The reference point we're going to want to be the center. So the first one is going to be the center. So in your OSNAP options down below, click on your center snap and find your center. Your second one could be the midpoint, and your reference point 3 should be one of the corners. In this case, I'm going to go to the negative x direction because that's where I made my offset. And now before I click anything, I have the option up here to copy my target. All right. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to copy this because now I don't have to rerun the command as I keep going. So I'm going to click, here's my first target point, there's my second, and then wrap it up with the third over here. And now I can keep going. Click, click, click. And yeah, it's true that in this case, because we're kind of, it's a simple orientation, we don't necessarily, it seems to work after we click the second point, but the command requires 3, so we have to give it what it wants. Anyway, so what we've done using that command and the offset is oriented, what we did is we orient each one of these now parallel with those lines that we drew earlier that were perpendicular to our section curves. So if that seems like a little bit of extra work, you'd probably be right, especially since if we go to the top view, those sections are actually straight on. They're orthogonal to the x-axis, and that's good. That's what we wanted. And that makes our lives a little bit easier. If these were oriented a little bit more in a, let's say, a little bit more of a rotation along the z-axis, we'd probably really need to use that command. But because their orientation is along the x-axis, we actually could do this in a slightly more simple way. And for that, we can just simply use rotate 3D. So if I make a copy of this, the one over here, and put it over there, we know that we have to adjust the position and space of this to match that line. And you can see that here. That's pretty straightforward just by using rotate 3D. So I'm going to rotate 3D. This is the object I want to rotate. The start of my axis is the center point, and then I'm going to hold shift and just click off in the x direction because I'm going to flip it, that's going to be our rotation axis. So I'm going to hold shift, click here, snap to my midpoint first, and then force that to my construction line. Okay. Now I had copy on, and I made a series of copies. Let's do that one more time, and this time I'm going to turn copy off. So let's make a copy of this first, pop it over here, zoom in a bit, run my rotate 3D command again. Click. After I set my axis, I can then go up to the command line, turn the copy off because that's unnecessary. Click my midpoint, set it to the red line, as you can see there. And so this would be the process that you can go through instead. It's in a way a bit easier because there's less coordination between lines, but it's also a little bit more cumbersome because you have to rerun the command each time and do a copy each time. So in a way it's a bit slower than the orient, but you can also avoid having to do all the offsets in the red lines. So you pick your option and go with it. When I did my file over here, I went with the orient command. As you can see all the way across, I have a double line. And that was just because that was my preference. So I'm going to go ahead and keep going. I'll pause the video and finish all these rotations across to that point, and then I'm going to mirror them around like I did before. Okay, so go ahead and work on that. Okay, so starting back up again, you can see that I've got all my section curves where they need to be along the edge there. Okay, the next thing that we want to pay attention to is the shape of these. And you can see in this image that they kind of taper out. They get thin in their height down here where they connect to the cable, but they fatten up a little bit where they're taking the most potential deflection, right? So up at the top of the arc, you can see that we've got some more dimension here. And I've estimated this to be around 16 down here and about 21 up here. So that means we need to set a different edge, a section curve up at the top of our model along these points. And that's easier because we don't have to orient those. These can just be drawn basically in the front view. So what I'm going to do is head over to the front view, and in my beam curve layer over here somewhere, I'm just going to draw a rectangle again. In this case, it's going to be 8 inches like this, and then 21 inches tall like that. Okay. And then it's just a matter of copying this from its center point along each one of these. I'm going to snap to all these points that are along my top profile here. And now I don't know for sure if all of the sections are exactly the same dimensions. They probably actually vary in size because they're different lengths, they have different spans. But for the sake of this model, I'm going to make them all the same. Okay, that's the easy part. Okay, so that's all in. And now we're ready to make our sweeps. So at the end of this first part, and I can delete these, we're going to start forming our main structure. And before we do that, I'm going to make a copy, once again, of all of this work, like we did before. Put it over here as to keep a history. Okay. Okay. So let's pop in a new layer. Call this. Let's call it primary beams. So pri beams. And we can leave that black, I suppose. And in order to draw the 3D beams, we can just run a sweep command. So we can run the sweep one rail command. Our rail is the blue line, and our section curves are. Before we do that, we probably want to copy or mirror all these around. Sorry about that. That way we don't have to mirror the 3D work. So you want this on the other side, so you can set all 3 section curves when we do the sweep command. And that'll be easier to run the 3D work out. So I'm going to click on all these guys. That. And I'm going to mirror that around my mirror line. Remember this? Click them over here. Okay, and there we have it. So those are ready to go now. All right. So sweep 1, rail blue, and select those 3 sections. Click OK. I'm going to turn on my ghosted view and can see that we have a kind of tapering beam that we've just drawn. Nice. I'm going to do one more of those. Blue, and then our 3 sections in order. And off we go. So here, we repeat the process until we're finished. And again, you can go halfway across and then mirror like we did before with everything else. So basically you draw them all out to there, model your center one, and copy all these using a mirror command from this point and over to save yourself some time. Alright, and that's going to wrap up part 1. I'm going to keep the video running as I finish these sweeps, but you can go ahead and work as I do. Now that all that's good, I'm going to type in, just to save some time, the select layer command. Select my pry beams, deselect the center one by holding down Control and clicking. That's a faster way of selecting those things. And I'm going to mirror them around like so, using that point, like this. And then I'm going to run select layer one more time, select pry beams, selecting them all at the same time, and then I'm just going to run the cap command. And we should be able to cap these, no problem. They're now capped. You can see that here. So I'm just going to fire up the shaded view real quick, and you can see that they have caps. Okay, so that's the part 1. We've modeled our general framework. We modeled the form. We framed it out, and then we put in our primary structural beams that go across between the 2 cables. Again, in this case, we're not going to model every single detail, but in the next step, in part 2, we will model the remainder of our structural elements. And we'll get into the surfacing toward the end.